Welcome to the Bible Made Clear, and we are jumping right in and continuing in 2 Peter chapter 2, talking about false teachers. Chapter 1 was an encouragement to grow in spiritual maturity because it's the false teachers that Peter warned would come that are the people that take advantage of unstable Christians, actually. So you don't want to be one of them. You want to grow and mature in your faith and in your understanding of the Word of God. So we had gone through up until 2 Peter 2:13, and we are in a section actually which is speaking about the corruption of the false teachers. So that goes through verse 16. And so we're going to jump right in at verse 14. If you like the channel, please hit, the thumbs up button or whatever. And so let's jump in at verse 14. Peter says of these false teachers, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, enticing unstable souls. And those are the ones that, again, they go after, and so you do not want to be unstable in your faith. He says they have a heart trained in covetous practices and are accursed children. So the Complete Biblical Library, which is a great resource, I know that the books are, they're not printed anymore. I think the last printing was about 20 years ago. But they're a great series. You can only get them on the used book market or perhaps electronically. But they made this comment, which I thought was really appropriate. They said, another charge against them, talking about the false teachers, is their insatiable lust. They have eyes full of adultery, illicit sexual intercourse in parentheses, and they cannot cease from it. Peter painted a vivid picture of a man who cannot see a woman without lascivious thoughts arising in his heart. This reminds us of Christ's words about the adultery and a lustful gaze in Matthew 5:28. Beguiling, that word is, and they're referencing the Old King James, which in the New King James would be enticing. So enticing means to entrap, catch by bait, entice. Exercised is the word in the New King James for trained. That's how it's translated. But exercised is exercising in a gymnasium or training. That's where the word comes from. They say these false teachers had trained their heart in the practice of covetousness, avarice, fraudulency, and greediness, in parentheses, and had become children of cursing. They were under a curse and headed for divine judgment. Now, obviously, this does not fare well for the false teachers, but we don't want to be caught by them. We don't want to give them opportunity. God will eventually judge them, but we certainly don't want to be the ones that are victimized by them. So when Peter says having eyes full of adultery and they cannot cease from sin, those two clauses should be taken together because they're actually grammatically connected. They're not separate. In other words, their eyes in the presence of women are continually and unceasingly sinning because they're filled with lust. And their heart is so filled with adulterous and immoral thoughts, their eyes actually are revealing it. So it says they cannot cease from sin. In other words, as long as they are ruled and dominated by that lustful passion, then they can't stop. This is a principle with any kind of sin. When we are dominated by it, we don't have control anymore. Romans 6 talks about, you either yield yourselves to righteousness or you yield yourselves to sin. Either way, you're going to become a slave to either side. Now, obviously, we want to be slaves of righteousness, and so in doing that, we would yield ourselves to Christ to live righteously, to practice righteousness, because once you yield yourselves to sin, and none of us are free from this in the sense that it can happen to anybody. Once we start down the road of sinning, it's going to bind us up. We are losing freedom every time we just continue to sin, because we become a slave to it. In order to yield yourself to something, you are given it the mastery over your life. And so we cease to lose control in that sense. And these false teachers would be no different. Now, look, the reality is that they could repent, but in the condition they're in, they're not going to. The immoral stares would cease, basically, if their heart was clean and pure, which that condition is not being described by Peter. Now, Jesus explicitly condemns it in Matthew 5:27-29. I'm sure we've read those verses, right? To look upon a woman with lust in your heart, you're committing adultery already. And then Job was aware of the sin and avoided it. In Job 31:1, he says, I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? In other words, Job understood this. Now, Job was actually technically probably the oldest book in the Bible. It was when around the time of Abraham that Job was alive. So Moses, who wrote the whole Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, he didn't come until, you got Abraham, and then Isaac, Jacob's kids, and then they're in Egypt for 400 years, and then, Moses is at the tail end of that, so sometime after. And so Job, this was very early in human history where Job recognized the problem of sinning with the eyes and coming out of the heart. Because like Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so the sins start within us, our sin nature, and then they find a manifestation to come out. Now, the sin that we're talking about here, this lustful looking and everything, this is not just limited to men. A woman can dress, walk, strive to charm some guy's eyes and influence them to sin. I mean, this is actually the current culture. It's all over social media and everything else. Now, here at our fellowship, over the last 35 years, we've had probably at least a couple of women that we've had to ask to leave because that's all they were here for. They were trying to, in some way entice some of the unstable guys and into fornication and everything, and they would go from guy to guy to guy. So, once you get wind of that, you realize what's going on, then, we have to ask them to leave. But this is a problem that is really related to the human condition more than it is to male or female. However, in Peter's day, most of the false teachers were men, though that can go to either side today. He talks about enticing unstable souls, right? So, like we said, enticing means to catch by bait. Metaphorically, it would be to beguile or really seduce somebody by flattery or some allurement. So, obviously, they would do this to different women. Peter uses the word again, this enticing word, in 2 Peter 2:18. Now, in both instances, the references towards immoral practices. So, we'll be at verse 18 right after this section that we're in. So, now, who do these false teachers seek after? Who do they seek out to entice? Obviously, they don't go after the steadfast, the strong, the virtuous. They go after the unstable, those that don't have a fixed and immovable conviction in regard to their life and their conduct. A Christian woman, frankly, whose principles are firm and settled, stable, she's not going to be drawn away by this kind of trickery or this bait of pleasure, promises, flattery, possessions offered by sensual men. Just to get into immorality, they wouldn't do that. And the people with firm convictions, whether it's guys or girls, it doesn't matter. They're not going to fall for this kind of trickery. Peter goes on, he says, they have a heart trained in covetous practices. The word trained, right, it's the word we get gymnasium from, means properly to train in gymnastic discipline. That's where it comes from, which means to exercise vigorously in anything, whether mind, body, or both. So you're talking about people like this is their plan. This is what they're working towards. This is all they think about. When I was younger and I played hockey and football, like night and day as a kid in high school, that's all I thought about. All I thought about was, how to perfect the sport, how to do better, what to practice next, areas where I was weak in. And now think about it. All that effort, mentally, physically, emotionally, training, all that's put into it. And then all of a sudden, you have these false teachers. They're putting that same level of effort into targeting unstable Christians to take advantage of them. It's amazing. The hearts and lives of these men are trained in covetous practices and all the methods that go with it. I spent a year and a half on a federal grand jury, which obviously I can't get into detail on. They have you sign all kinds of agreements and everything. But I can tell you this, that over that year and a half, dealing with really all kinds of different criminal cases, obviously, criminals, they have a sixth sense to sniff out weakness in the lives of other people. And when they find somebody that they can take advantage of, there's no mercy. I mean, these people are like sharks. They spy out their prey. They know that they can really take advantage of them. And they don't just use them and move along. They grind them into the ground. They really do. It's so awful what they do to them, And as I sat, you have to listen to testimony and witnesses and everything in a grand jury. And as I sat, through all of these, and some of the cases were terrible, stuff you don't even like to think about. But as I sat there and I listened, I thought, these criminals, if they put the same effort into legitimate business, they'd be millionaires. They have to work their criminal schemes 24/7. They get no time off. They get no vacations because they're running a criminal enterprise, and they can't let anything happen that could possibly go wrong and them get caught. Now, I guess, my point in this is that these false teachers, they are criminal. There's no doubt. They're stealing from people. They're taking advantage of them. What they're missing is that they're going to have to deal with God, because they're dealing with God's people. And so these false teachers, they're the same. They know there's opportunity within the Christian community. Christians are typically, giving and sensitive and want to help people, and so they utilize that. They take people's money and all their resources, as much as you'll give, and they are the best deceivers on the planet because they look like Christians, they blend in with Christians, they know the language, they know the phrases, they know what to look like, but in their hearts they're wolves. Interesting, Jesus talked about in Matthew 7 at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he said that they were like wolf in sheep's clothing, right? He said, Matthew 7:15, he says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. So the word for ravenous is used a few times in the New Testament. In Luke 18:11, the verse says, I am not as other men are, extortioners, right? This is a Pharisee talking. And then in 1 Corinthians 5:10, Paul's talking about those that don't enter the kingdom of heaven. He says the covetous or extortioners, that would be an old King James word, or with idolaters, right? And then the next verse is it's adding on, or a railer, a drunkard, or an extortioner, right? So you get the singular and the plural. In 1 Corinthians 6:10, right after that, in 1 Corinthians 5:10 and 11, he's talking about having fellowship with people that are claiming to be Christians that are living in these immoral lives. And he says that, he's taking the person that at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 5 that was having sex with his stepmother and the church was not dealing with it. He said he needs to be excommunicated, and you need to have no fellowship with him, so that for the destruction of his flesh, so his soul may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. But then he goes on to say, look, I'm not talking about like everybody in the world. He says you'd have to leave the world. Like, how could you couldn't witness to the world. You couldn't talk to people, because that's how the unsaved lived. It's in 1 Corinthians 6:10 that he mentions extortioners, how they're not going to inherit the kingdom of God. In other words, they're thieves, they're robbers, they dress up like sheep, and they steal from the sheep. But this word for ravenous is really it's an extortioner. It's somebody that extracts money or something from somebody else. That's what they are. Now, Paul was concerned about the same thing when he met the elders at Miletus in Acts chapter 20. Verse 29, he says, for I know this, that after my departure savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. He said these wolves are going to come in among you, right? They'll be dressed like sheep. They wouldn't be allowed in if they were dressed like wolves, right? They know how to blend in. I mean, they're good at it. I don't know how else to say it. There wouldn't be any other way for them to get there. People seem to be very accepting to wolves, but that's because of their personality and charm. Look, if a wolf was growling, nobody would have anything to do with them. But because their personality and their charm, it disarms Christians, and then that's what these false teachers are good at. They are professional at it. And a profession is anything you get paid to do. So Paul says they'll be savage, right? The word means heavy, harsh, demanding to keep laws or rules, right? So their teachings will be imposed on believers, but the advantage will be all to the wolf. So they'll come up with fancy teachings and everything, but ultimately it's gaining some control over the people to get something from them. And Paul says they're not going to spare the flock. There's no merciful to the vulnerable. Those are the ones they seek out. We would look at somebody that was very vulnerable, maybe somebody that, in society that within a church family that was certainly much more vulnerable than some of the other people, and we would want to protect them. These people, they search out for these vulnerable people, and they'll take them for everything they can. It's just awful. They're no different than the criminals that I sat on that grand jury and had to deal with. So, look, I've seen a lot of these through the last 40 years. A lot of these false teachers that are dressed up, like sheep. And frankly, I'm amazed that Christians, so many Christians, follow them. But there's a reason for it. The people are drawn away by their personality and their charisma and their presentation and their unique understanding of the Bible. They've come up with something that is just really fancy and new. And so the vulnerable and unstable Christians are captivated by the fancy presentation and the new truths that they're coming out with. But unfortunately, they never actually evaluate them based on what they're teaching, because they're ignorant enough about the Bible that the false teachers can take advantage. Now, the false teachers are not stupid. They also know that no matter what they teach, there's going to be a lot of people that reject them, but that's fine with them because it's a big pond, a lot of fish, and they'll get some of them. And even if they get a lesser percentage, the percentage that they get, they're happy with because they can take them for everything. And unfortunately, the people that are victimized by them, they listen to their teaching, and their teaching has enough of the truth in it to make it palatable, but enough poison in it to deceive and hurt people. So unless Christian has enough working knowledge of the Bible, they'll be a prey to these people that are twisting the scriptures to manipulate them to their own advantage. Now, Peter goes on at the end of the verse. He says, they are accursed children. This is actually a Hebraism, meaning literally children of the curse. That is, they're people devoted to the curse, or who will certainly be destroyed. They're under a curse, and they're headed for divine judgment. That's basically what it means. So their condition was so vile and wicked that they were only worthy and deserving of God's curse. In other words, his sentence of condemnation and doom. Why would that be? Well, he answers it in verse 15. He says, they have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. Forsaken the right way and gone astray. So the right, literally the straight way, is that which adheres to the true teachings of Christ. But they left that behind, and so they were caused to wander and to fall by Satan. I find it interesting where it says they have forsaken. This tells me that they were going the right way, and they have gone astray. So at some point, they were actually learning what the truth was, but decided that they were going to utilize it for their own ends. Peter isn't getting in here to, he's not teaching eternal security or losing your salvation. Like, that's not his issue. He's just distinguishing the behavior of the false teachers. Some people want to get off into speculation, were they saved, were they not saved? Now, in one sense, it doesn't matter. If you fall into the false teacher category, you're in trouble. You're in trouble with God, and you're in trouble eternally. So you stay out of it. Now, staying out of it will keep you on the right. Otherwise, you will have abandoned that, forsaken it, and gone after the way of Balaam. So if a teacher begins to apply the rest of the verse, in other words, going after Balaam in that way, then they've gone astray from Christ. And so, though the passage seems to indicate that these guys were never saved, there's no way to absolutely be sure about that. So that's up in the air. But anyways, he goes on. He says, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor. In other words, they go after the money. That's what Balaam did. So pastors who make money the key to their ministry, and there are some out there on Christian television for sure. This is what is being talked about by Peter. Now look, there are some Christian TV figures or whatever that they're into money, and they are blending money into Christianity. To them, the gospel is tied to finance and everything else. I'm not going to evaluate, and nor is it my job to tell you that, this one is saved and this one isn't, or whatever. The reality is that as a Christian, I wouldn't listen to anybody that money is a major aspect of their platform. Now, I'm not talking about, at the end of a program, sometimes people will say, hey, listen, if you want to support us or whatever. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who in a very crafty way will interweave finance into their message. And look, some of these guys, they talk about money, and they'll tell you right up front that this is what it's about. Jesus wants you to be rich. That's what the Bible's about. Gaining the secret understanding of finance and wealth and all this other nonsense. But once they do that, they are putting themselves into the false teacher bucket. Okay. Now there are pastors that do that on that are on TV or whatever, on some social media platform, that are mixing together the gospel and finances, but that is corrupting the gospel, and it is a heresy. So Paul warned Timothy about men of corrupt minds in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He said they were destitute of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. So the gain that he's talking about is financial gain. So what Paul is saying is that to Timothy in 1 Timothy 6, there are people, even in Paul's day, that were teaching that the truth about, walking in a godly life and everything, that it was a means of financial benefit. He said, from such withdraw yourself. Now, he said, now godliness with contentment is great gain, right? If you want a real benefit, if you want to really prosper, then you want godliness, and then you want to be content with a godly life. However, what Paul was referring to writing to Timothy was people who had taken basically the Christian life and mixed it in such a way with finance that was the goal. And now, following them, right, following the way of Balaam, means to imitate another's conduct or behavior. So the prophet Balaam was motivated by covetousness, and these men are just basically walking in his steps, what Peter is saying. Now, it's well to point out that in the fact that these wicked men resembled Balaam in other ways also. In other words, both professed to be servants of God or religious teachers, which Balaam professed, and that's what these do. Both induced others to sin, the same kind of sin, right? So Balaam counseled the Moabites to entice the children of Israel to illicit practices or sexual practices with their women, and introduced licentiousness into the camp of the Jews. So you can read Numbers 25, 1-9, where the sin is recorded, and Numbers 31, 13-16, for Balaam's part in causing it. In other words, he was the one that instructed Balak, the king of Moab, how to get the Jews to live in a way where God would judge them, you know. And so he said, hey, have the Moabite women go over, entice the Jewish men, and say, hey, well, let us show you how we worship our gods. And then, it was sexual immorality and fornication, and so, and then God judged them for that because they were violating the law. So, the law of Moses. So, this can be a positive teaching on the abuse of grace or giving license to sin. In other words, a false teacher that is going to remove the godliness from their teaching, in the sense that they will lead people to sin. They can lead people to sinning by either teaching them to abuse grace or giving a license to sin itself. In other words, if they're abusing grace, they wouldn't be saying go out and sin. They would present grace in a way where grace almost advocates sin. Paul said, should we sin? And again, in Romans 6, should we sin because we're under grace? He goes, God forbid, may it never be, right? Now, on the flip side, it may not be a positive teaching to sin in some way, but the avoidance of sin altogether. In other words, without sin, we have no gospel, because there's nothing to be saved from. I don't need to be saved from a bad habit. I don't need to be saved from depression, which is caused by my sin nature in some way or another. I don't need to be saved from feeling bad about myself or low self-esteem or any of that stuff. I need to be saved from my sin that is sending me to hell. And my sin is manifest in my behavior, and I understand it really well because I didn't get saved till I was 24 and I did plenty of sinning. I understand the whole life of sin. So, as a pastor and as a Bible teacher, we need to deal with sin. Now, if I choose to not talk about sin because it's kind of an ugly subject, well, I'm only giving you half the truth, and maybe less than that. Certainly, it's not going to offend you because sin is offensive, and quite frankly, the gospel is offensive because the gospel deals with our sin, right? 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the gospel. Paul said, I deliver to you of first importance the gospel, right? That Jesus died for our sin. Well, if Christ died for my sin, then I must have sin. I must be a sinner. There'd be no reason for him to die and to be buried and to raise up and conquer death if it wasn't for sin, because death is the result of sin. Sin causes death. So because sin is inextricably tied to the work of Christ's redemption and the gospel itself, to avoid discussing it at all is not teaching the gospel. And it is actually, it is skirting the issue and avoiding talking about the very thing that brings damage to people's lives. Now, look, I can sit here and I can kind of craft some pop psychology and give you some stories to make you feel better, and talk about a lot of things that are, positive and nice. And you may feel a little bit better afterwards. You may say, hey, that guy, he was pretty good. I mean, he made me feel good listening to him because I kind of, pumped you up a little bit. But the reality is that the thing that's causing your problem, I never address. It would be like going to a doctor and, you have cancer that's going to kill you. And I say, hey, you know what? Why don't you take this aspirin? Now, the aspirin may make your headache go away if you have a brain tumor, but it's not addressing your problem. Imagine if you had a disease that was curable by an antibiotic, But I didn't want to really tell you that you had that disease because it's an ugly conversation. So instead, what I do is I give you some medication to mask the pain the disease is causing. Well, I mean, they ought to take my license away. But the problem is with false teachers that are out there, this happens all the time. They never really address the core problem that is the human condition of sin. And the reason that they don't like to get into that is because, quite frankly, it will convict them. So what they do instead is they just talk about other things. And the other things that they love more than anything is typically money. And other than that, it's, kind of the lifestyle that comes with the money and, and all the positivity that, is what they see as a driving force to it. But anyways, any Bible teacher that basically avoids the discussion of sin ignores the foundational reason for the gospel itself. And this can happen with decent Bible teachers. They can slip right into it, and they need to be careful. But these men are spiritually dangerous. Whether they're teaching to abuse grace, to go out there and sin, or just avoiding the conversation of sin in general. And they are so close to the real deal, like a legitimate Bible teacher, that it really takes, many times it takes the gift of discernment to decipher them. Or in a sense, to crack the code where they're at. Having the gift of discernment, discernment literally is dividing between the spirits, can be difficult. Can be difficult to have it because you point out people that are fakes, and then other people say, "Oh, you're so judgmental." But the problem is if God shows you that somebody is fake, or you listen to them and you can tell they're fake by their words, and then all of a sudden you say, well, that person, they're really off, and it's like, oh, you're so judgmental. Well, it can be tough having the gift of discernment. Look, I know the Lord has given it to me. That doesn't mean I have discerned everybody over the past 40 years. But very early on when I got saved, in the early 80s, I used to listen to Walter Martin. He used to be the original Bible Answer Man program guy, and he taught on cults and comparative religion, so he was really good at that. And it was interesting because he would get a lot of calls from cultists because they would try to challenge him. And I'll never forget the first time a Jehovah's Witness called him, asked him a question, and he said, "Are you a Jehovah's Witness?" And I thought, why would he ask them that? They just asked him a question. And they said yes, and I was like, how did he pick that out? So I was really curious, and as I listened to him, I realized that as you learn more about the cults, you understand their language and you understand their perspective. So they will use all the same words, but they have a different meaning. So when they ask a question, the question only makes real sense if you put their meanings into the words as they understand them. And so I would sit there and I would listen to him day after day. If in the 80s, you recorded stuff on cassette tapes, and if I couldn't listen to him, I would set my cassette tape deck to record at the time that he would come on, because I would always listen to him. I was just fascinated. But taught me a lot about the cults. I bought a lot of books and read up on different cults and everything. But then, once I understood how they thought, it was very easy then to detect them. It was like surprisingly easy. Well, as you get to know the Bible better and you understand, like, if you don't just read it like a novel and you actually dig in and start, putting some real effort into it to understand, not only like the words on the page, but like what's happening? Like when Jesus is teaching something, like, why is he saying that? What is he actually getting into? Why did he quote that Old Testament verse? So the same with Paul or Peter or whoever, kind of like what we're doing in this little study here. Then what happens is, as you learn more and you start to understand what the Bible has as a perspective and what it's trying to teach us, then when somebody teaches contrary, it just sticks out like a sore thumb. It becomes so obvious. And, but anyways, you know, since the 80s, I don't know, I've been able to kind of probably from listening to Walter Martin and digging in myself, I've always found it easy to kind of pick out cults, and even cultists that I don't know, what cult they come from. Once they start talking, it's like the antennas go up. You just know. Now, at times God has given me discernment too, where I, had new information, but I just knew it was not the Lord. But look, all false teachers offer a personal benefit to their followers. But the benefit is beyond what the Bible offers, but that's to capture the follower. So if I'm kind of ignorant and carnal and, I want something, but the Bible is not offering it to me, the false teachers know that. They will offer something beyond the Bible because they know there's a whole realm of Christians out there that don't know enough. They still have a lot of desires for things that they don't understand the Bible well. And I mean, they're perfect for these guys. They're just like serving them up on a platter. But in the long run, the people end up suffering. They figure it out eventually. They get disillusioned and, they'll, suffer in their relationship with the Lord, or sometimes lose it altogether. But the disillusionment that they suffer, because they're banking on certain things being true, and they never really kind of come to fruition. In other words, the benefit that they're promised they never receive, which Peter talks about later in the chapter we'll get into, but it often results in a terrible discouragement and lack of trust in the Lord and then in prayer. So it's an insidious thing. These false teachers really frustrate me. I can't imagine how the Lord sees them. But there is one thing that they do love, and Peter goes on here at the end of verse 15, who love the wages of unrighteousness. Balaam loved the wages of pay or unrighteousness, right? They're called wages of unrighteousness because it's money he received for disobeying God. He got it unrighteously, right? So Balaam was continually sent gifts from Balak, the king of Moab, so that he would curse Israel, because Israel had come through the wilderness area, moving on up to, in the area of Moab, or, kind of where Jordan is today, so that they could cross over into the land of Israel, at that time Canaan. And so they had defeated Sihon and Og, the king of Bashan, and then they were coming to the Moabites, and the king of Moab realized, he said, well, wait a minute. We couldn't beat Sihon. We couldn't beat Og. And these Jews, they just beat them both. So they said, we need help. So that's when they sent for Balaam to come and curse Israel, because Balaam had a reputation for being able to do that, to curse people. So at first Balaam didn't go, and then he ended up going. In other words, first he refused. Balak sent these guys with money, and Balaam asked the Lord, and the Lord said, don't go. And so he went down, he told the guys, he said, hey, you know what? Jehovah said I can't go, so I can't go. And he said, if Balak would give me his house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the word of Jehovah my God to do less or more. Right? That's Numbers 22:18. But soon afterwards, he began to seek God's permission to go with Balak because they came back with more offering. And he was allowed to go, but he was only to speak under the condition that God was giving him the words. So Balaam was too addicted to the money to worry about God's will or God's command. So he went with Balak's men, and on the way, he was now on the way to get the pay for his services. It reminds me, years ago, I was offered a job by a friend, and I sought the Lord. I told him no, and I said, the Lord made it clear. I explained why, and he asked me 2 more times to get hired, and I said, why would you have me go back after I told you the Lord said no? But he was obviously more interested in the money than he was interested in doing God's will. And, obviously I never went, but I just, it was hard for me to understand that a friend would do that, which I guess means they're not as much a friend as I thought they were. But anyways, verse 16, he says, but he was rebuked, Balaam. Now this is when he's on the way. So God, after he asked the second time, he said, can I go? Like, they're offering me more money. He said, go ahead, go, but don't say anything beyond what I'm telling you. So verse 16, he says, but he was rebuked, right, while he was on his way the second time, for his iniquity. A dumb donkey speaking with a man's voice restrained the madness of the prophet. So he was rebuked for his iniquity, right? The word iniquity is a word used in the New Testament, and it means wickedness, transgression, or lawlessness. Now, he was rebuked, obviously, in an unusual way, right? You get an animal talking. It says, the dumb donkey speaking with a man's voice restrained the madness of the prophet. Now, in Numbers 22, 21 to 35, after the rebuke from the donkey, and also the angel of the Lord right after that, Balaam confessed, I sinned, for I knew not that you, meaning the angel, stood in the way against me. Now, therefore, if it displease you, I'll go back again, right? So that's verse 22-34 in Numbers. Now, evidently, Balaam took some of the rebuke to heart, right? But after that, he does only speak what God tells him to speak, to the frustration and consternation of Balak. Balak wanted him to curse Israel, and he couldn't. Every time he opened his mouth, he was blessing them. So how was the prophet's madness restrained, like Peter is saying, when he actually proceeded to go with Balak? In other words, he didn't turn around. It appears, if you combine Numbers 22:20 and 22:35, and you can do this at home, that the wrath of God wasn't kindled against him as much for going, because he had inquired a couple of times, and he was then told to go. Though God said no the first time, it was obviously God's will not for him to go, but Balaam was addicted to the money. That's why he prayed a second time to go. Now, we're not told when he left to go with them that he intended to speak what God told him to. In other words, it was only after he was on the way in rebuke that God said, hey, you only tell them what I say, right? Because God had said, fine, you want to go ahead and go. And then when he was on the way. So it wasn't as much the fact that he was going, but evidently he was going with the wrong motive, because the reason he was getting paid was to curse God's people, and that's why he was going. So that's why God says, hey, you better not say anything beyond what I'm going to tell you to say. So he wanted his expensive gifts, and, Israel would be cursed, but this was his madness. This was the madness of the prophet. So, look, the love of money often makes people do insane things. All criminal enterprises are based on money, sex, or power. They are, and sometimes all three of them together. But anyways, God talked to him through two mouthpieces, the donkey and the angel of the Lord. I think at that point, I wouldn't have been so confident to go forward. But afterward, his intention changed, and he was allowed to proceed. And then he became a mouthpiece of God. God spoke through him to bless Israel. Balak was upset at him. So the iniquity and the madness that Peter is speaking about is more in the reason or motive for going, more than the actual going itself. Because some people say, well, gee, he still continued to go. He did. And he should not have went. However, that he did go, it was the reason why he was going, which was the problem. So the complete reference account to Balaam and everything he did is in Numbers chapter 22 through 25. And then in 31, his issue there with teaching teaching Balak. But however, we learn of the evilness of Balaam in chapter 31. It says, after the cursing was restrained, he later gave the sinful counsel in Numbers 31, causing, thousands of Israelites to be slain by a plague. In other words, his restraining of his madness was not permanent, and he found a way to get those wages of unrighteousness. He found a way to get the money one way or the other. Now, Jesus himself refers to this when he was dictating the letter to John the Apostle in the book of Revelation, when he was writing it to the church at Pergamos. In Revelation 2:14, he says, after he commended them, he says, but I have a few things against you, because you have those who hold the doctrine or the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and commit sexual immorality. So that's from Numbers 31, right? To eat things sacrificed to idols and commit sexual immorality. These two sins involve pagan worship practices. That's what this church was involved in at Pergamos, right? So not only were there pagan meals where the food was sacrificed to idols, and we learn that in 1 Corinthians 8, but often sexual immorality was the normal and expected worship practice at these pagan assemblies. I think that, oftentimes we don't realize they didn't have like restaurants, in the first century like we do today. If you wanted to go out for a meal, you had to go to a pagan temple. They'd sacrifice animals to their gods, and then they'd, sell them and cook them up, and people would have their meal. But it was through the temple prostitution that was also a means of supporting the temple. So it was the prostitution, whether male or female prostitution, that these pagans practiced in that pagan world. And so at Pergamos, they were obviously, the church had allowed this teaching to proliferate, where Paul in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, he dealt with, getting away from it. Like they shouldn't be going out to do that. The church was allowing this, and in Revelation 2:15 it says, you also have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. So Jesus rebuked both practices, both activities, right? Both the sexual immorality and the priesthood, right? So the Nicolaitans were clergy that imposed a priesthood on the laity. Nico is to conquer over, and laity is the people. So you're conquering over the people, hence the term Nicolaitans. It was a compromise that Paul was against. The Christians going out to the temples to just get a meal in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10. You can't mix pagan worship practices in the Christian life and expect to grow spiritually. The compromise is going to damage a person's relationship with the Lord and dampen their spiritual life. Now, I'm going to mention one more thing before we quit here. I'll probably get blasted for this, but, yoga is similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. Yoga is Hinduism. There's no way around that. Christians who practice yoga are asking for trouble. They're working against themselves spiritually. There is no such thing as Christian yoga. It's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. Yoga didn't exist apart from Hinduism. It can't. Yoga means to yoke. And people that practice yoga, whether they realize it or not, they are involved in a pagan practice trying to yoke themselves to Brahman, the head Hindu deity. Now, the Hindus have 330 million gods, but the head one is Brahman. So, look, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10:21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons, right? Could the Corinthians actually perform both activities? Like, could they have communion at church and then go out to the pagan temples and then, get involved with their rituals, eating their food and everything? Absolutely, they could do both. Were they having true fellowship with the Lord while they were doing it? No, absolutely not. Ultimately, disobedience is a mark of unbelief. And this is what shows Balaam to be a false prophet and why Peter is using him in application of what to and not to do. Now, what makes it so fascinating is that Balaam actually heard from God and had some kind of relationship with him in the Old Testament. He was not a Jew, but Balaam is the example of everything bad and wrong spiritually and what not to do. So Christians should not be using Balaam as a model for Christian ministry or Christian living, obviously, right? So why would we use Hindu practices to enhance our spiritual life or even incorporate them in some way? So yoga and Hindu meditation practices, they're often tied together. Back in the 70s to 80s, they used to have TM classes, Transcendental Meditation. People would go to these classes, they would learn how to meditate and, sit in the lotus position and all this other stuff. And then they'd be given a mantra at the end, and then they were to go home and repeat that mantra and practice their transcendental meditation to get into their, peaceful state and all this other stuff. And what they didn't realize was the mantra was the name of some Hindu god. So here they are, they're, reciting this, the name of these Hindu gods, having communion with demons actually, and don't even realize it. And Christians are just ignorant of that. Like, why would we traffic with demons? Now, for those that do yoga that are knowledgeable of all this, and they understand that, hey, in Hinduism, the reason you sit like that, and, the Kundalini snake power that's supposed to wind up your spine and the whole third eye and everything, when they, the ones that understand all that and think it's okay, and they keep going to their yoga classes, are demonstrating their want to be like Balaam, because they're more interested in what they see as a personal physical benefit than in obedience to God, quite frankly. And Christians that do it in ignorance, that don't realize, they are going to suffer the same effect, but just not be guilty of the direct rebellion. Look, I can give you story after story of people whose lives have been plagued by demonic experiences and just some really disturbing things that that are involved in this stuff. Look, many others they just don't, that practice yoga, a lot of Christians, they just don't seem to grow spiritually. They seem to stagnate. They just never move on. They become nominal Christians, which again is the very problem. And spiritual compromises are dangerous. Just because the world promotes an exercise doesn't make it okay. It's no different than legal marijuana. Just because marijuana became legal doesn't mean that Christians should be getting high. It's still, pharmakia, right? It's still using drugs for hallucinogenic purposes. So, look, there are plenty of exercise programs that existed before yoga came into the Western world. They have nothing to do with yoga practices. Yoga didn't invent stretching and exercise. And Christians need to make a decision whether they're going to be loyal to Christ or compromise with worldly standards. And, I know that there are churches that have their yoga classes and they think they've Christianized it. To be honest with you, they're in the twilight zone, okay? And there is no Christian yoga. And if you go to a yoga class and you have no idea where the person's coming from, the person could be neck deep into Hinduism, they could be confused themselves, but what you're doing is, it's like going to a pagan temple. You're trafficking in the demonic and expecting for there to be no effect. So look, what the culture offers, whether it's legal or whatever, it doesn't make it okay with God's word, right? James 4:4 says this: adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity? That means hostility with God. Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Like I'm probably making an enemy of some of you right now. But I'll leave you with this admonition from the Apostle John. In 1 John 2:15 and 16, he says, do not love the world. And in the Greek, the grammatical construction actually is stop loving the world. It assumes that when it says do not love the world, the assumption in Greek is that they are loving it, that they're involved in some practice. He says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Now he's writing to Christians. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it, but he that does the will of God abides forever. So my final admonition to you is, you want to do the will of God. Why on earth would we ever get involved in anything that we know can even be demonic, never mind is specifically connected to a false religion, pagan practice, in that way. So anyways, if you stayed this long, God bless you. But look, until next time, I say it every time, but I can't say it with more heart-held sincerity. May God richly bless you as you continue to study his word.